This is a Hope 1032 podcast.
Hello, welcome to Undistracted. I'm your host, Laura Bennett, and this is the podcast where we learn from our guests how to be better at building our lives with intention around our passions, our purpose, and deal with some of the stuff that gets in the way of that. You can find video versions of many of these chats on the Hope 1032 YouTube channel. Subscribe wherever you're listening and reach out to me on Instagram at laura.bennett_. Our guest today is Ben Fielding. He's been a songwriter, worship leader in the church for many years now. His new project, The First Hymn, sees he and fellow songwriter Chris Tomlin recreate the oldest hymn ever found. The First Hymn dates back over 1,800 years, and he had the privilege of bringing it to life for a modern audience.
I've spent, now months, actually years now, thinking about this specific hymn. And really kind of part of it, just imagining what it would have been like to be in the room in the 3rd century, hearing the early church sing. Talking to John about this hymn has been fascinating because he said that the musicologists that have studied this papyrus say that the melodic structure is basically the melodic structure of what they would call a tavern song, like a pub song of the day. And so that there was something in the heart of the hymn writer that wanted to engage the people of the time. They wanted to write the music that would feel familiar, that people could walk into church and maybe be hearing about Jesus for the first time, but hear melodies and songs that would sound kind of familiar, but that had this distinct edge about them. And so I imagine the song being a song that everybody could sing. And I think that's just a great objective to have, even to this day as modern hymn writers, to be able to write songs that everybody can gather together and sing together.
That's something that we hear a lot of churches these days talk about, of course. And some would say it's this really revolutionary thing. Let's play music that isn't just traditionally familiar in a church context. Does it feel strange to think that that's not a new idea, that that's not something that's very inventive? In fact, it's maybe been the heartbeat of the church for a long time.
I think that that's the case. I think that particularly if you look back to the early church, I mean, this was a group of people that were being persecuted for their faith. So to think that, that they're engaging their community in a faith that was not popular. In fact, it was they faced a lot of external resistance. So the idea of them being able to engage people in the music that they were singing, and even in the theology that they were espousing, was essential. And so I think, today we can think about what we're doing in terms of trying to reach our society. But I think it is good to have the humility to kind of go, no, that's what the church has been doing for now millennia. And, I think our challenge is, how do we do it well in our day? I think that's a great question to ask. But we can also look back to the Renaissance. We can look back to these incredible moments in history where there's a proliferation of art and creativity, and they were often led by the church or led by believers who saw their craft and their art as coming from the divine, but being a way to kind of give something back to the divine, to God, and to be able to express this infinite God that's hard to kind of define with just words. But if we can add melody, if we can add color, then maybe we can see a different aspect of God.
And the piece of papyrus that was found, it's such a small sample, I guess, of what I'm imagining would have been a longer song. Perhaps there were more lyrics on it. Mm-hmm. But from what was found, what were the words there, the lyrics that really stood out to you that the writer was trying to use to communicate that worship, that adoration?
Yeah, so I think they had about 80% of the lyrics is what the historians suspect, and about the same of the melody. And so we were really careful to not want to try to, add too much. We've filled in a few lines, but the hymn itself is just spectacular. You have the hymn starting with, "Let all be silent, let the rushing rivers cease." So this idea of creation just pausing as we sing our hymn. And then this part is wild. "To our God, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit." So it's a Trinitarian hymn. And I think that's fascinating. because it's probably about 100 years prior to the Council of Nicaea, to Constantine, and you have the church singing about the Trinitarian God. And I think that's very significant because, of course, it's debated, when the Trinity as a doctrine sort of made its way into the church. But here we have the church singing that well before some people would say that that doctrine found its way. And then the other, I think for me, the culmination, the pinnacle moment in the hymn is where this early church that is been experiencing so much opposition for their faith. This is before Roman rules, before Constantine, before Christianity found favor. Here you have the early church singing, "To the only giver of all good gifts, we sing amen. We sing our praise." And so the audacity and maybe this bold faith to think that these people who are suffering so much for their faith saw and thought to sing about God, our God, the only giver of all good gifts, I think is just a beautiful, and it's a profound thing for us today. We look at the amazing privilege that we have as believers to be able to publicly talk about our faith, to publicly sing about our faith. And it's just a great reminder to us. Can we sing with the same level of faith and belief that he is the only giver of all good gifts?
How does it affect your faith to read lyrics like that, to sing a song like that, 1800 years old, to have that connection to fellow believers from such a very specific time in history? How does that affect your own faith now?
I think it's incredible to think about how many centuries this message, this gospel, the good news of Jesus has not just subsisted, but has thrived. And you think about the early church; it was a persecuted people, but it's at that very moment that the gospel is thriving. That there's opposition, but there's this amazing proliferation of the message. So I think about the fact that the message has stood the test of time. You've got people singing about the deity of Christ, only 100, 200 years after he walked the earth, and they're singing in opposition. And I love that thought that the hymn of God is also a song of protest, as Walter Brueggemann calls it. It's a song that kind of calls out how things should be different. It's a bold declaration of how God's way is different to the way of the world. And I think we still sing, and we still can sing that same song. And I find that just wildly encouraging and challenging. Are our hymns of today songs of protest, songs that that talk about a different way, about God's way? And the thought that, even just as believers, we can gather together, we can read the creeds together, we can agree on these core aspects of our faith, pretty much across the entire Christian church. We actually share a lot in common when you think about how bold those statements are. But then you think that we can do that today, but to think that today we can also sing the same song that has now echoed through church halls for centuries, I just think is a wild thought and deeply encouraging. And of course, is perhaps a picture of how worship also unifies creation with heaven, because we're told, particularly in the book of Revelation, that all of heaven is already singing the song and they've been singing the song of worship to our God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit for forever. So we echo that song, and I think that's incredible too.
And maybe that's why there's a little bit of a familiarity, I suppose, to this hymn. Obviously, with yourself involved with Chris Tomlin, there'll be a sound that people who've experienced your music before will be familiar with. But I think the lyrics that we've touched on around the Trinity, even the idea of becoming silent and that sense of wanting adoration and worship to be there, something set apart, that feels a bit familiar. And maybe, as you're talking about the way that creation and heaven connect, that's probably why, because there's something that is enduring about those ideas.
I think so. I think that, as an extension perhaps of, Tom Wright in his book, Simply Christian, talks about the echoes of God through creation and this sort of blurring of the line between what is secular and what is divine, or what is supernatural, what is spiritual. And I think that, we see that in worship. I think that worship is a thin place, if you like. It's a place where we sense this echo of why creation exists. And we sense this echo of our internal longing to worship God, who is the only thing that is worthy of worship. And we find ourselves in life, I think, giving, adulation, giving worship to things that don't deserve it. And we're left kind of with this sense of dissatisfaction because we're ultimately disappointed. But when we sing the song of heaven, when we sing the song of worship, we find every word to be true. And in fact, probably more true than we can even imagine when we sing about the glory of God, the goodness of God, the love of God, the mercy of God. When we're singing about his attributes, we're only ever really kind of scratching the surface. And so I think that echo is kind of that longing to worship in truth, in spirit and in truth, gets kind of fulfilled a little bit here on earth, and we get a taste of actually why it is that we were created.
I find it interesting that you mentioned a moment ago that worship has this element of protest to it almost, because that's not really a word you hear coming up very often when we talk about worship. I think people would be more familiar with it as being uplifting, or this thing we do on a Sunday to connect us with God in this more like relational kind of way. Why do you bring that idea of protest to worship? Why do you think that's part of what it involves?
I think the song that we sing and the art that God has given us to create exists to bring him into focus. And I think there has always been, since the fall, God's attempt to get through to his people and to creation, to remind them of his reality. And I think we find ourselves, to this day, coming in the church, and I think your point is a good one, that we can sing these songs and they feel uplifting. I think that's great. And I think sometimes that's the protest. Joy is protest, because we find ourselves in our community so despondent, so dissatisfied with, if we're really honest with ourselves, with our pursuits and with the things that we've put our hope and put our trust in. And I think worship song becomes a song of protest against that way. And it becomes a signpost to a better way. And, we can be disappointed in when we trust people who let us down. But when we sing a song of worship and trust in God, who never disappoints, that is it's a song of protest, because it's a song that's saying we've been disappointed. Everything else that we've experienced has failed. And yet now we're turning to the one who never fails. And, we can think about that protest, I think, coming in lots of different forms, whether it's the love of God, as we know, God is the source of all love. But when we sing a song of worship about the love of God, it is a song of protest against the failed love and expressions of love that we see around us. And knowing the heart of God, that God's heart is actually to see us as worshipers then transformed continually into his likeness, so that we become this, even through our worship, something happens in us that makes us agents of that protest, if you like, in the world, where we go out and we find ourselves being the hands and feet of Christ, being the mercy of Christ, being the love of Christ. And I think that sits on the other side of this protest, is the call to actually be the agents of change that God would have us be in the world.
Between what you've done with the first hymn, bringing a song like that touches on these things to life, and I think also what you're doing with Commons now, with Reuben Morgan, it seems like you're wanting to pursue a more simplistic is not necessarily the right word, but perhaps a simpler direction for worship, something that's really sincere, really grounded. Is that true? Like, has something driven a desire in you to want to come back to some of these core aspects of worship that maybe some of the hustle side of writing and etc. can distract from?
I think Reuben and I have always had ever since we started writing together, which is now, quite a few years ago, the first song that we sat down and write ended up becoming Mighty to Save. And I remember when we started writing that song, we were very intentional about what it is that we wanted the song to be, what we wanted it to achieve. And we want to write something that everybody can sing, where every line, you don't have to second guess it. You can just go, no, that's true. So it either comes straight from scripture, or it's just such a clear declaration of a summary of things that we believe. And that then melodically they have to be accessible. It doesn't mean they have to be boring, but they have to be accessible. And we think about it, we talk about it a lot in terms of wanting to write songs that are good friends to a worship leader, where when you stand up to lead worship, it's a daunting thing. You're standing in front of people who are there because they want to worship God, but any tool that can help you do that job, I think, obviously we have the empowerment of the Lord, and that's paramount. But practically, you go like, what songs will help? And I think that's really our heart, is to go. We've been writing for a lot of years. We've got a lot of friends who are good songwriters and great worship leaders. But our heart is to go, how can we bring that together in a way that gives something back to worship leaders and to churches, where it feels like any song that you grab from that we're creating should help. It should be easy. You should be able to stand up there and lead it, and it kind of helps do your job for you.
And I think something that maybe Chris Tomlin said about the first hymn especially that kind of relates to that, maybe it was John Dixon, don't want to credit the wrong person, but it was something along the lines of a song like this, and maybe with the ones you're doing as well, there's like a unity in them. There's not a distinction between different denominations or different kind of faith perspectives. It just is, here's basic truth. Here's something that we can all kind of agree on. Is that something that you're wanting to work toward as well? Like, so that there isn't these lines between the elements of Christianity that might otherwise exist?
Yeah, I mean, I feel really compelled by the idea of bringing unity in the church, and coming back to, what I said about the creeds. Like, I think if we gathered together Christians from across the world, different cultures, different political systems, different denominations, different parts of the church, and we read the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed, and said, put your hand up if you believe this, keep your hand up if you believe this next line, I think we'd find we'd all be standing there with our hand up at the end of the creed and all those creeds. And then I think about what worship music has done even in our day, and we might believe slightly different things, particularly around the periphery of our faith or our doctrine. But we're often singing the same song or the same songs. And so worship, I think, does have a way, when it's done well, when we're writing well, that our songs can bring down some of those barriers. And I think they're kind of like, hopefully they're good ones, but they're kind of like modern creeds, where we can kind of meet somebody from a different part of the church, or even from a different part of the world in a different part of the church, and we can all sing Holy Forever. And we can go, I sing that too. And there's that sense of like, it does bring us together. It does unify us. And I think, at the same time, it's a great challenge for songwriters, is to kind of go back to the reason that we do this, and to ask those questions of how unifying is what I'm writing. And could you sing this anywhere across the church? And I'm not saying every song has to do that, but it is a good litmus test, I think.
Yeah, and John Dixon clearly likes the way that you treat songs, that Chris Tomlin treats songs, because I think wasn't it the Creed a few years ago that he approached you and other writers to say, hey, can you guys do a modern version of this? So he clearly respects the way that you handle, these kind of these songs.
Well, it was interesting, because that would have been maybe 2014, I think it was, that John wrote about the Apostles' Creed. And he just said, look, if anyone can, modernize this and give melody to this creed, I mean, we're reading it in so many parts of the church, but imagine like right across, particularly the modern and more perhaps evangelical or Pentecostal even parts of the church. Imagine if people were singing the creed. And so that was an amazing project to work on. And to be honest, I mean, it was really challenging. And the fact that it kind of worked, I think, almost just felt like a bit of luck, where you sort of go, thank God for it, of course, but you kind of go, gee, that was like, maybe that feels like a one-off. We could never do this again. And so when John reached out about the first hymn project, and we sat down here in Sydney, and John said, I've got another project for you. And he told me about, this discovery. And in Oxyranka and about the lyrics of the first hymn. And I'm so compelled by them. This is
Mm.
amazing, John. Yes, you should do it. And yes, someone should write the song. But I just had this feeling of like, can you do it? Can you do it again? And so, it was kind of, I said yes, but it was sort of with like this enthusiasm because I think the project's amazing, but also this sense of reluctance or maybe just, caution because I was like, I just humble caution. I was like,
Mm.
I don't know, can we actually execute it well? And then, getting Chris Tomlin involved was just a really pivotal moment in the process because he sort of came in with this incredible enthusiasm. And John and I had already kind of gone back and forward a little bit on it and had sort of, some initial structure of even what the song could do and how it could work. And then Chris came in just with this like wave of like enthusiasm and it really did kind of light the project up. And the way the story goes is that Mark Hadley, who's the director of the documentary, had said, okay, what we're going to do is like, we'll get you and Chris together in Nashville and you guys will start working on the song and we'll film that and kind of show how the song, started with John talking about it and then went all the way through to you guys writing it and then recording and whatever. And so I was like, cool. But then I started talking to Chris and we started sending ideas back and forward. And we were so just into this idea, so excited about it that we kind of finished the song in 2 weeks, pretty much.
You ruined the movie.
So I called Mark and I was like, I've got good news and I got bad news. Bad news is I don't think we can do the songwriting, film the songwriting part. And he's like, oh, why not? I was like, well, because the good news is I think we've finished the song. And so what we ended up doing is we got John out to Nashville and then he sat down and was like, have you got anything to show me? And we were like, we think we do. And we played him the whole song and he's sitting there sort of in tears, hearing this hymn that he's been interested in, he's studied, he's explored for so many years, sort of come to life in front of him in that room. It was a really special moment, which you'll be able to see in the documentary.
Yeah, there's a little taste of it in the trailer, which is kind of nice. But I also think maybe John does these sorts of things, like invites you into these projects just to put a challenge out there, like to see if you can. Both you and Chris are obviously incredibly talented and you've done so much in this space. And I wonder if he just goes, let's see if these super talented individuals can do this, which is a bit cheeky, but a bit fun. But I also think, like right now, it seems to me like we're in a new era of Christian worship music in some respects, because in recent years, there's been a real splintering of talent. Like you've got so many people like yourself, Ruben, your Brooke Lidgett Woods, etc., that are going off into these new spaces that they haven't existed in before. When you observe that, the way that there's these new creative outlets arising for all of you guys in different ways, do you feel like that is, or have you observed any kind of distinction about what that's doing to the industry? Is it making you more innovative? Is it giving people expression that they didn't have before? How would you observe that or describe that?
Yeah, I think that there's so much more music today that's been released, and I think there's a lot of practical reasons for that. I get excited about it as a creative because I do think it gives more room for people to express their distinct and unique take on worship and on even on music, on their sound, how they want to express their faith. I think that's all very good and all very healthy. I think it helps to give more communication, more expression for the church, because we can, you don't obviously have to sing every song that any particular person writes. And so you can kind of go, oh no, I love that. I love what that could do in our church community. So I think there's a lot more nuance there for people to draw from. But I think the thing that is sincerely and deeply encouraging for me is to just watch people who have maybe even gone through hardship. And as you talked about, like a bit of a scattering, I kind of look at it and go, there have been moments in the last few years that have felt really difficult. And it's felt like, you sit back and go, you just see parts of the church being sort of, looks like they're getting broken apart. And you go, well, where's God in this? Like, what's on the other side of this? And you pray about it, and you have hope, you believe for the best. But I feel like we're kind of now seeing some of God do what He says He'll do. That He's working all things together for good for those who love Him. And you see some of the what might look like breaking and scattering on one hand, but you're seeing seeds starting to grow, and you're seeing germination. You're starting to see life come of it. And I look across even some of my peers and I go, wow, like I feel like there is so much more, and there's so much more life, and it looks really healthy. And I think that I'm grateful for it. And so, yeah, I think it is. I think it does give me perspective that God is ultimately in control. And I think even when things look like they're completely out of control, he's not out of control, and he's still doing what he said he'd do. He's working it together for good. He's still building his church, and he's still building the lives of those who love him.
Yeah, it's exciting times, Ben. Thank you so much for chatting with us today. I really appreciate it.
Great pleasure. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Undistracted. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you're listening, rate, review it, share it with a friend. Let me know what you think as well. Find me on Instagram at laura.bennett_, or you can email undistracted@hope1032.com.au. Until next time, enjoy living this undistracted life.